You have heard the saying, chew the meat and spit out the bones. Now, if you try to apply that to critical race theory, what you end up doing, since all critical race theory is bones, and if you're using that framework in a sense of, well, let's talk about Scripture, how it can be scripturally right, what parts of CRT can be scripturally right. So we'll take the CRT and again, chew the meat and spit out the bone. Well, what you end up doing, or inevitably, you have to take the Scripture, the meat which is Scripture, and you turn that into bones, because the doctrines in Scripture will not work with the doctrines of critical race theory. So one has to give, and if you're holding to critical race theory, then you have to, when you read Scripture, you have to consider much of it just bones. One thing is very important. It always comes up. People want to look back at America's past, and they'll talk about slavery. Now, some want to talk about American slavery, but you need to define that. If you don't have a problem with slavery, scripturally speaking, but you have a problem with American slavery, then define what you are talking about. Don't just throw it out there and say, well, American slavery. Define that. If you're talking about, well, they went to Africa and kidnapped people, no, you don't. There's no kidnapping when you go to another nation. That's not what biblical kidnapping is. That's among your own people. And frankly, most of the folks that come from Africa were bought from other Africans, and those Africans brought them and put them on the ships. So you really have no argument there. But anyway, just slavery in general was my point here. Many want to point back, and they talk about slavery and now we need to have reparations, and they want to talk about in a scriptural framework. Well, there's no scriptural framework that would say there was any problem with slavery. Now, some people, I've lost friends over this. They close their eyes to Scripture. It's not true. Scripture regulated slavery. It never did anything to end slavery. It regulated slavery. So from that point of view, if you're looking at Scripture, well, you have to know what the Scripture says about what slavery was. It's just what it was. It just was. You have to ignore that and say, oh, no, God was against it all, even though Scripture does not prove that out. So you have to turn that Scripture into bones, and you spit that out. So you're left with nothing. You're left with nothing. So you either hold the Scripture as being true, or you look at these other things like critical race theory or whatever's out there, and you try to make that true. But they're not both true at the same time. They're not both true at the same time. But let God be true and every man a liar.